In 2010, Havenwood Police Sergeant Frank Miller vanished. One Tuesday evening in October, he finished his shift, called his wife, Sarah, to say he was stopping by the station to file a final report, and was never seen again. His patrol car was found 2 days later, parked neatly at a scenic overlook on the edge of the city, keys in the ignition, wallet on the seat. The initial investigation was a frantic, desperate affair. The woods around the overlook were scoured by hundreds of officers and volunteers. The river below was dragged. His financials were dissected, his personal life examined with a clinical, invasive precision. No signs of struggle were found. No ransom note ever appeared. Frank Miller was a family man, a father to a 12-year-old daughter, Emily, and a cop with an impeccable 18-year record. He was quiet, steady, and universally respected. But as weeks turned into months with no leads, a grim, unofficial narrative began to form, whispered in the station's hallways and adopted by a public hungry for an explanation. The pressure of the job, they said. Maybe a secret debt. Perhaps he just grew tired of his life and walked away, seeking a quiet anonymity far from the gray skies of Havenwood. The investigation went cold, the file relegated to a dusty shelf in the archives, its weight settling not on a case board, but on the shoulders of his wife and daughter. It became another one of the city's sad, unanswered questions, a ghost story told to rookies about the cop who simply evaporated into the autumn air. But 14 years later, in the relentless sun of a late summer afternoon, the past was violently unearthed. A demolition crew had been hired to tear down the old North Point cannery, a derelict brick monolith that had sat rotting on the industrial waterfront for decades. As a claw excavator bit into the building's thick concrete foundation, it pulled up more than just rebar and shattered stone. A worker, shielding his eyes from the dust, saw a flash of dark fabric tangled in the debris. He shouted for the operator to stop. There, in the jagged wound of the earth, lay a bundle wrapped in what looked like a weathered, black police-issue rain slicker. It had been sealed within the concrete itself, a tomb hidden in plain sight. As the foreman carefully cut away the hardened material, the shape beneath became horrifyingly clear. It was a human skeleton, its bones stained dark by time and decay, curled into a fetal position. And clutched in the brittle cage of its right hand, a small, tarnished silver object glinted dully in the harsh sunlight, a police sergeant's badge. The ghost of Frank Miller had finally come home. The discovery sent a shockwave through the Havenwood Police Department, dredging up a history most had either forgotten or chosen to bury. The case file, thick with the brittle, yellowed paper of 2010, landed with a thud on the desk of Detective James Corbin. Corbin was 42, his face a map of long nights and too much coffee, but his eyes held a sharpness that missed nothing. He had been a rookie back then, a fresh-faced patrolman who saw Sergeant Frank Miller as the kind of cop he wanted to become. Firm but fair, dogged but decent. Miller's disappearance had been a formative event for him, a stark lesson in the world's capacity for unresolved darkness. Now that darkness had a location and a body. The medical examiner's preliminary report was delivered by a grim-faced technician. The remains were male, consistent with Miller's height and age. The cause of death was unequivocal. A single, small-caliber gunshot wound to the back of the skull, the slug still lodged in the sphenoid bone. An execution. The slicker was standard HBD issue from that era, and dental records would soon provide the final, formal confirmation. This wasn't a man who had walked away. He was a man who had been silenced. Corbin felt the weight of those 14 years settle in the room, a palpable presence. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet office. He was now the shepherd for Miller's ghost, tasked with finding a truth that had been entombed for over a decade. He walked down to the sterile quiet of the evidence room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The slicker, the badge, the bone fragments, they were all laid out on a steel table, artifacts of a forgotten murder. His first official step was a briefing with Police Chief Reynolds, a politician in a uniform who had been a lieutenant in another precinct back in 2010. Reynolds, eager to manage the explosive media narrative, assigned Captain Marcus Thorne to act as Corbin's guide and liaison on the case. Marcus was Frank's shift commander, Reynolds said, his voice smooth and authoritative. He knew Frank, knew the department back then. He'll be an invaluable resource. Captain Thorne was a pillar of the department, a man whose public image was forged in community outreach and ironclad competence. He was handsome in a severe, silver-haired way, his uniform immaculate, his handshake firm. He met Corbin in his sprawling office, a window overlooking the city behind him. "It's a damn shame, Jim," Thorne said, his voice a low, somber baritone. "We all hoped Frank would turn up one day, maybe having made a new life for himself. To find out he was here. All this time." He offered Corbin complete access, any resource he needed. He seemed genuinely supportive, a bastion of stability in the sudden storm. Yet, as Corbin left the office, a strange, indefinable chill traced its way down his spine. It was a feeling he couldn't name, an instinct whispering from a place deeper than logic. Something about Thorne's perfectly calibrated grief felt hollow, a performance so polished it was invisible to everyone, but the one man whose entire life was dedicated to seeing the cracks in a facade. The forensics team worked with meticulous, almost reverent slowness. Every speck of dust, every fiber clinging to the skeletal remains of Frank Miller, was a potential voice from the grave. The service weapon found buried alongside him was confirmed as Miller's Glock 22, its serial number a perfect match to the one logged in his file. One round was missing from the magazine, though the ME had recovered a .22 caliber slug, not the .40 caliber of a Glock. 2 guns had been involved. The killer had used his own. Then came the anomaly. As a technician painstakingly cleaned the dirt and concrete dust from the skeleton's right hand, she found something clutched so tightly within the phalanges that it must have been grabbed in the final moments of life. It wasn't part of Miller's uniform or personal effects. It was a single ornate silver cufflink, heavy and obviously expensive. The face of it was engraved with a strange, stylized crest, a serpent coiled around a surveyor's compass. Corbin stared at the object through the evidence bag. It was a clue born from a desperate, last-second act of defiance. Frank Miller had reached out and taken a piece of his killer with him to his makeshift grave. This cufflink was the killer's calling card, and he likely never even knew it was missing. The next task was the one Corbin dreaded most. He drove to a quiet suburban neighborhood, the trees lining the street older and fuller than they had been 14 years ago. The house was the same, immaculately kept. Sarah Miller opened the door. Her face was lined with a grief that had never been allowed to properly heal, a wound kept open by the poison of uncertainty. Standing beside her was a young woman with her father's determined eyes, Emily, no longer a child but a 26-year-old journalist for a local online paper. The news was a brutal, physical blow. Sarah sagged against the doorframe, a quiet sob escaping her lips. The confirmation of death was, in its own horrific way, a form of release, but it was a release that tore open the old scar. Emily, however, reacted with a quiet, burning intensity. The vague ghost story of her childhood had just become a murder investigation. As Corbin spoke, laying out the grim facts with as much gentleness as he could muster, Emily's journalistic instincts kicked in over her grief. "He was working on something," she said, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. "Right before he disappeared. He was quiet about it, but he was stressed. He kept a box of files in his home office, things he didn't take to the station. He said it was for a special project." She led Corbin to a small, preserved room, Frank Miller's study. And there, on a bookshelf, was a simple cardboard banker's box. On the side, in Miller's neat block lettering, was a single word: overload. Emily handed the box to Corbin. "He told me once that the most important clues are the ones nobody else thinks are important," she said, her gaze locking with his. "Please, find who did this to him." Corbin took the box, its weight far heavier than its physical contents. He was now holding the last remnants of Frank Miller's final investigation. A cold trail he had to pray was not yet completely extinguished. Back in the sterile confines of his office, the overload box sat on Corbin's desk like a puzzle box from the past. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale ink. He opened it, revealing dozens of neatly organized files. They weren't official police reports, but Miller's private notes, scribbled on legal pads, with newspaper clippings stapled to them. As Corbin sifted through the contents, a pattern began to emerge, one that had been completely overlooked in the original investigation. For 6 months leading up to his disappearance, Sergeant Miller had been secretly tracking a series of high-value cargo truck hijackings on routes leading into Havenwood. Officially, these were logged as separate, unrelated crimes falling under the jurisdiction of 3 different counties. But Miller had seen a connection. His notes were meticulous, detailing dates, times, cargo manifests, and routes. He'd highlighted the similarities. The hijackers were professional, using signal jammers to block GPS and communications, and they always knew exactly which trucks to hit, targeting high-end electronics, pharmaceuticals, and designer clothing. They were ghosts, leaving behind no witnesses and no evidence. Miller's central thesis, underlined multiple times in red ink, was chilling. Inside source. HBD/dispatch. He believed someone within the law enforcement apparatus was feeding the crews the information they needed. He had compiled a list of dispatchers and officers who were on duty during each of the 10 hijackings he was tracking. The list was long, and on it, Corbin saw many familiar names, including a younger patrol officer named Marcus Thorne. Corbin felt a jolt. He took the theory to Captain Thorne, framing it as a discovery from the old files, wanting to gauge his reaction. Thorne looked over the notes, his expression a mask of thoughtful concern. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "I remember Frank being a bit obsessive about this," Thorne said, his tone patient, almost paternal. "He brought it to me once. Honestly, Jim, I thought he was chasing shadows. These were professional crews, yes, but they could have gotten their intel from anywhere. Trucking company insiders, warehouse workers. Frank was convinced it had to be a cop. He was a great sergeant, but he was burning out. The job gets to you. Sometimes you start seeing conspiracies in every corner." Thorne's words were a perfect echo of the old, dismissive narrative. He was skillfully painting Miller as a paranoid, stressed-out cop whose obsession had led him down a dangerous path, perhaps confronting criminals on his own and getting in over his head. It was a neat, tidy explanation. But for Corbin, it was too neat. Thorne wasn't just dismissing the theory. He was actively rebuilding the very psychological wall that had allowed Miller's murder to remain a cold case. Every word of reassurance from the captain felt like a carefully placed stone, sealing the tomb a little tighter. Corbin's intuition, that faint whisper of doubt he'd felt in Thorne's office, was now a persistent, nagging voice. He knew, with a certainty that defied the captain's calm logic, that Frank Miller hadn't been chasing ghosts. He had been hunting a very real monster, and he had gotten too close. The silver cufflink was Corbin's lodestone, the one piece of physical evidence that wasn't part of a carefully constructed narrative. It was a mistake, a loose thread in the killer's otherwise perfect crime. He photographed it from every angle and sent the images to a contact at a high-end jeweler in the capital. The response came back within a day. The design, a serpent coiled around a surveyor's compass, was the exclusive emblem of the Vanguard Club, a private society that had operated in Havenwood from the late 1990s until it mysteriously disbanded in 2011, just a few months after Miller's disappearance. The club was notorious in its day, a place where the city's wealthiest businessmen, politicians, and influential figures met in secret. It was a place for backroom deals and handshake agreements that shaped the city's future. Getting the membership list was nearly impossible. The club's records were sealed and stored in a private archive. But Emily Miller, with her journalist's knack for digital deep dives and source cultivation, managed to acquire a bootleg copy from a disgruntled former employee of the archive. When she emailed the PDF to Corbin, his blood ran cold. The list was a who's who of Havenwood's elite. There were the expected real estate developers and bank presidents. There were city council members. And there were 4 names from the Havenwood Police Department. One was a retired chief. 2 were lieutenants who had since moved away. The 4th name was Captain Marcus Thorne. The pieces began to click into place with an awful, sickening clarity. The cargo hijackings, the inside source, the club of powerful men, they weren't separate threads, they were part of the same rope. Corbin began a series of quiet, off-the-books interviews with retired officers from Miller's era. Most were tight-lipped, unwilling to speak ill of their former colleagues. But one, a grizzled, cynical detective named Peterson, who had been forced into early retirement, finally gave him something. The Vanguard Club wasn't just a drinking society, Peterson rasped, his voice rough with cheap whiskey. It was the real city hall. They ran this town. Deals got made there that decided who got building permits, who won city contracts. If you were in, you were golden. If you were out, you were nobody. Corbin asked about Thorne. Peterson snorted. Marcus? He was their golden boy in blue. Ambitious as hell. He made sure the department looked the other way when it needed to. He knew how to manage problems. He was the gatekeeper. Frank Miller, the quiet, incorruptible sergeant, would have been a direct threat to an operation like that. He wasn't the type to be bought or intimidated. He was the type to methodically follow the evidence no matter where it led. And it was leading him straight to the doorstep of the Vanguard Club. The cufflink wasn't just a clue. It was a symbol of the very power structure that had swallowed Miller whole. He had grabbed a piece of the monster before it dragged him under. Captain Thorne must have sensed the shift in the investigation. He could feel Corbin's focus narrowing, the questions getting sharper. He moved to regain control of the narrative, employing the classic tactic of a masterful manipulator, creating a diversion. He called Corbin into his office, his expression grave. "Jim, I think I found something," Thorne said, sliding a thin file across his polished desk. "I was reviewing Miller's old informant logs. He had a CI, a small-time hustler named Ricky Gallo. Gallo was deep in the cargo theft scene. According to this, Miller was supposed to meet him the night he disappeared. Gallo himself dropped off the map a week later, OD'd in a flophouse across state lines. Inside the file was a grainy photograph, supposedly taken by a surveillance unit a few days before the murder, showing Gallo meeting with 2 known members of a violent hijacking crew. The implication was clear. Gallo had betrayed Miller, selling him out to the crew for a piece of the action. They killed the sergeant, and then, to tie up loose ends, they gave Gallo a fatal hotshot. It was a perfect, self-contained story. It gave the department a posthumous villain and 2 long-gone culprits. It explained everything. It was clean. The chief, briefed by Thorne, was ecstatic. "This is it, Corbin," Reynolds said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Gallo. It was always Gallo. Write it up. We can close the book on this, finally give the Miller family peace." Pressure mounted from the chief's office to declare the case solved. But Corbin's gut screamed foul play. It was too easy, a story delivered on a silver platter by the one man he suspected most. He took the file back to his desk, his eyes scanning every detail. He kept coming back to the surveillance photo of Gallo with the hijackers. Something about it felt wrong. The lighting on Gallo seemed slightly different from the other 2 men. The shadows were just a little too crisp. It looked less like a candid surveillance shot, and more like a staged picture. He took it to a friend in the digital forensics lab, asking him to analyze it off the record. "Intuition over logic," his friend teased, but agreed to run it through his software. While he waited, Corbin felt a profound sense of isolation. The entire department, led by the chief and guided by Thorne, was ready to embrace a convenient lie. He was the only one standing in the way, armed with nothing more than a gut feeling and a single ornate cufflink. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight of expectation to close the case and move on. But every time he thought of Frank Miller, of the quiet determination in his notes and the defiant act of grabbing that cufflink, he knew he couldn't let it go. He was standing at a precipice. He could either accept the tidy fiction being offered to him, or he could take a leap of faith into the dark, trusting that his instincts were leading him toward a far more terrifying truth. The call from his friend in the forensics lab came late at night. "You were right, Jim," the voice on the other end said, hushed and serious. "The photo's a composite. A damned good one, but it's fake. Gallo was pasted in. Whoever made this had access to some high-end software, and more importantly, old HBD surveillance files to get the images of the other 2 guys." The confirmation hit Corbin like a physical blow. Thorne hadn't just suggested a theory, he had manufactured evidence to support it. This wasn't a misdirection, it was an active, criminal cover-up. The realization was terrifying. Thorne wasn't just a corrupt cop from the past, he was a clear and present danger, a man willing to fabricate evidence to close a murder case he himself had likely committed. Corbin knew he couldn't go through official channels anymore. The chief was already sold on the Gallo narrative, and confronting him with a conspiracy theory about his star captain would get him suspended or worse. He was alone, or almost alone. He called Emily Miller. He met her at a late-night diner, the air thick with the smell of grease and stale coffee. He laid everything out, the Vanguard Club, Thorne's membership, the cufflink, the faked photograph. He watched her face as she processed the information, seeing her grief harden into a steely resolve that reminded him so much of her father. "He's not just a suspect anymore," Corbin said, his voice low. "He's actively obstructing this investigation. He's trying to bury my case the same way he buried your dad." Emily, using her journalistic credentials and secure university databases, began to dig into the financial records of the Vanguard Club members. For 2 days, they worked in tandem, fueled by coffee and a shared obsession for the truth. They built a web, connecting the dots between the club's influential members. The pattern was undeniable. A logistics company, owned by a close friend of Thorne's and a fellow club member, had a habit of buying salvaged goods from insurance companies, the very same high-end electronics and pharmaceuticals that had been reported stolen in the hijackings Miller was investigating. The hijackers would steal the cargo, The trucking company would get an insurance payout, and Thorne's friend's company would buy the lost goods for pennies on the dollar, selling them through a network of shell corporations that funneled the profits back to the club's inner circle. It was a massive, seamless money laundering operation, and Frank Miller had been on the verge of exposing it all. Then came the breakthrough. Emily was searching a public photo archive of old society events. "Jim, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight. She turned her laptop around. It was a photo from the Vanguard Club's 2009 annual gala. A group of men in tuxedos were laughing, holding glasses of champagne. And there, in the center of the group, was a younger, confident Marcus Thorne. He was smiling broadly at the camera. And on the cuff of his left sleeve, catching the light of the camera's flash, was a silver cufflink, identical to the one they'd found in her father's hand. The serpent and the compass. It was the final, damning piece of the puzzle. They had him. Corbin knew a direct confrontation was impossible. Thorne was a captain, and his word against the detectives, even with the evidence, would be a hard fight within a compromised department. The photograph proved Thorne owned the cufflinks, but it didn't place him at the murder scene. He needed more. He needed a confession. He bypassed Chief Reynolds entirely and went to the one person he hoped was still beyond Thorne's sphere of influence, District Attorney Helen Pryor. Pryor was a tough, no-nonsense prosecutor with a reputation for integrity. In her secure office, Corbin and Emily laid out the entire case, from Miller's old notes to the faked photo of Gallo to the financial records and, finally, the gala photograph of Thorne. Pryor listened intently, her face unreadable. When they were finished, she stared at the photo for a long, silent minute. "He's been the department's poster boy for a decade," she said softly, more to herself than to them. "If you're right, this will tear the city apart." She looked at Corbin, her eyes searching his. "But if you're right, we have to. We can't go at him for murder yet. The cufflink is powerful, but his lawyer will call it circumstantial. But this financial evidence, the fraud, the money laundering, that's concrete. We bring him in on that. We put him in a box, shake him, and see what falls out." The plan was set. They would execute a warrant for the hijacking and fraud case, not the murder. It would be a surgical strike. The DA's investigators, not HBD, would serve the warrant at Thorne's home, bringing him to a secure interview room at the DA's office, far from the familiar comfort of his own precinct. Corbin spent the next 24 hours preparing. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the nervous energy replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He reviewed every document, every note, every photograph. He memorized the timeline of the hijackings, the names of the shell corporations, the dates of the financial transfers. He wasn't just building a case for fraud, he was building a cage for a killer. He planned the interrogation like a military campaign, mapping out his lines of questioning, anticipating Thorne's denials, his deflections, his condescending dismissals. He knew Thorne would be arrogant, confident that he could outsmart any detective. Corbin wouldn't try to outsmart him. He would just methodically build the walls of the truth around him, brick by brick, until there was no room left for lies. The final piece of his plan was the small, sealed evidence bag containing the tarnished silver cufflink. He placed it in his jacket pocket. It was his last resort. It wasn't evidence for a fraud case. It was a message from the grave, and he would deliver it personally. The interrogation room was cold and stark, painted a dispassionate shade of gray. A single, heavy table sat bolted to the floor between two chairs. The air hummed with the low thrum of the building's ventilation. Captain Marcus Thorne sat opposite Corbin, not in his immaculate uniform, but in a tailored suit. He had been picked up at his home an hour earlier and had surrendered with a calm, almost amused detachment. He looked more inconvenienced than intimidated. Two of the DA's investigators stood silently against the wall. "Detective Corbin," Thorne began, his voice smooth as polished marble. "This is quite the spectacle. Dragging a captain out of his home on a fraud warrant from 14 years ago. You're going to have to explain this to the chief. And to me." Corbin ignored the threat. He began slowly, methodically, laying out the details of the hijacking investigation. He spoke of the professional crews, the signal jammers, the inside source. Thorne listened with a faint, condescending smile, as if indulging a slow-witted student. "We've been over this, Jim," he said with a sigh. "It was Gallo. A tragic but closed case." "It was never Gallo," Corbin said, his voice flat. He slid the forensic analysis of the faked photograph across the table. "Gallo was in another state when this photo was supposedly taken. You manufactured this evidence to close a case you knew was still wide open." Thorne's smile flickered for a fraction of a second. That's a serious accusation. You'll need more than some lab geek's opinion. Corbin continued, unfazed. He detailed the money laundering scheme, naming the logistics company, the shell corporations, the bank accounts. He laid out financial statements, connecting Thorne's personal accounts to offshore entities that had received payments. Thorne's composure remained, but a muscle in his jaw had begun to twitch. He stonewalled, denied, deflected. He called the evidence circumstantial, a series of unfortunate coincidences. He was a pillar of the community, a decorated officer. Who would believe this fantasy? The walls were going up, but Thorne was still confident he could climb them. Corbin knew it was time. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Thorne's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show the gala photograph. He simply reached into his jacket, took out the small evidence bag, and placed it gently on the steel table between them. The tarnished silver cufflink sat under the harsh fluorescent light. Forensics found this at the cannery, Corbin said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was clutched in Sergeant Miller's hand. He must have torn it from his killer's shirt in his last moments. A desperate attempt to leave a mark. To name his murderer. He watched Thorne's eyes. The captain stared at the cufflink, and for the first time, the mask of controlled arrogance shattered. The confidence drained from his face, replaced by a look of pure, cold recognition. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, Thorne looked up at Corbin, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of release. He was always so self-righteous, Thorne said, his voice devoid of all its previous warmth, now flat and clinical. He couldn't just do his job. He had to be a saint. He found a thread, and he wouldn't stop pulling. The hijackings, the club, it was a perfect system. Clean, efficient. It benefited the city. It benefited a lot of important people. But Frank, he couldn't see the bigger picture. He just saw his precious rulebook. He leaned back, the confession flowing from him now, a stream of remorseless poison. I told him to drop it. I warned him. I invited him to the cannery that night. Told him I was meeting the informant, Gallo. He was so eager, so sure he was about to break the case. He was a good cop, but he was a fool. He turned his back to me, looking out over the water, talking about justice. I put the pistol to his head, and it was over. Quick. Professional. We buried him in the foundation the next day, when the concrete was being poured. No one was ever supposed to find him. He looked from the cufflink to Corbin, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. All this, undone, by one damned cufflink. He was more trouble dead than he ever was alive. The confession hung in the air, a testament to a depravity hidden behind a decade of honor and respect. Thorne's arrest sent a seismic tremor through Havenwood. The story exploded, a sordid tale of a hero cop murdered by his own commander, the decorated captain revealed as a cold-blooded killer at the heart of a vast criminal conspiracy. The subsequent investigation, led by the district attorney's office, was like turning over a large, flat rock. The rot underneath was deep and widespread. Thorne's confession implicated a dozen other prominent figures, the core members of the Vanguard Club. Businessmen, city officials, and 2 other retired police officers were arrested, their carefully constructed lives of respectable power crumbling into dust. The Havenwood Police Department was thrown into chaos. Chief Reynolds was forced to resign in disgrace, his willful blindness exposed. An interim chief from outside the city was brought in, tasked with the monumental job of rebuilding trust, not just with the public, but within the ranks of a department that now looked at itself with suspicion and shame. A few weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the one on which Frank Miller had disappeared, Corbin drove back to the quiet suburban house. Sarah and Emily met him on the porch. The frantic storm of the media had passed, leaving a somber quiet in its wake. Corbin didn't have much to say. Words felt inadequate. Instead, he handed Sarah a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was Sergeant Frank Miller's badge. It was no longer tarnished and caked with the dirt of a grave. It had been cleaned and polished until the silver gleamed. In the sunlight, "His official record has been amended," Corbin said softly. "He's being posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor. Not as a man who went missing, but as an officer killed in the line of duty, while investigating a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of this city." Sarah held the badge, her thumb tracing the familiar ridges of the sergeant's insignia. The tears that fell were not of raw grief this time, but of a sorrowful, profound release. For 14 years, her husband's memory had been tainted by whispers and doubt. Now his honor was restored. His sacrifice had meaning. Emily looked at Corbin, her eyes clear. "Thank you," she said. "You gave him back to us." Later that evening, Corbin stood in his office, looking out the window at the sprawling lights of Havenwood. The city looked the same, but it was fundamentally changed. The darkness that had festered beneath its surface had been lanced. The process of healing would be long and painful, but it had begun. He thought of Frank Miller, a good cop who followed a thread of truth until it cost him his life. And he thought of the single, defiant act of a dying man reaching out, grabbing a piece of his killer, a final, desperate message to the future. It had taken 14 years, but the message had finally been received. Justice had been delivered, and the ghost of Sergeant Frank Miller could finally rest in peace.